Dealing with Historical Bias by James Smith. In this vodcast, we'll be exploring many areas. What is historical bias? This is where we define what it means to be biased. What are the different types of bias? This section is where we discover a few of the different types of bias. Exploring our scholarly article. In this section, we'll be breaking down the main points of the scholarly article found. How do we recognise bias? As teachers, it is important that we know how to recognise bias and how to effectively educate our students on how to recognise bias when they are researching historical resources. Personal teaching strategies to deal with historical bias. In this section, I'm going to outline a couple of my personal teaching strategies to use within the classroom. Reflection of personal learning. This section is discussing my own personal reflection of my learning experience and the main points that I found to be the most outstanding when researching this topic. What challenges were faced? In this last section, I will be outlining some of the challenges I found during this vodcast assessment and how I overcame these challenges. Before we gain a deeper understanding of what historical bias involves, it is important that we have a clear understanding of what it actually is. According to the Oxford Dictionary, bias is defined as inclination or prejudice for or against one person or group, especially in a way considered to be unfair. So now that we understand what bias is, we can now look at the different types of bias. There are several different types of bias in history. Let's have a look at what these are. Invisibility. The most fundamental and oldest form of bias is the complete or relative exclusion of a group. Shockingly, many history textbooks published for the 1960s would leave out information that had to do with African Americans. Now, although our history books are improved, information about people with disabilities and also homosexuals have been left out. Stereotyping is perhaps one of the biggest forms of bias. This includes assigning a set of characteristics to apply to all members of a group. For example, assuming that all Asian people are good at maths is a cultural stereotype. Another type of bias is imbalance and selectivity. This includes history teachers or history resources only presenting one interpretation or one side of an issue or story. Another type of bias is unreality, or having rose-coloured glasses. Many researchers have noted the tendency of historical books to gloss over unpleasant facts and events in our history by ignoring prejudice, racism, discrimination, exploitation, oppression, sexism, and intergroup conflict. They are denying students the information they need to recognise, understand, and perhaps someday conquer problems in society. The scholarly article that we will be summarising is Bias in Historical Description, Interpretation and Explanation, written by Bayhan McCullough, published by Blackwell Publishing in February 2000. Let's have a look at the main ideas. The first main concept that the article is discussing is the concept of bias in historical interpretation, description and explanation. It is basically outlining why there is bias in history and why historians are often biased in their writing. One of the quotes that stands out is, "Both nature and history are sublime, and any account of them is inevitably selective." This is suggesting that while history resources should be factual, main ideas and events are often left out. According to this article, how much detail historians include in their descriptions of a historical subject depends upon the scale of their writing, but they would only bore readers if they recorded every fact they knew. The main concept that this article is discussing is whether or not bias matters. A biased account of an institution will emphasize the role of those aspects the historian wants to praise or blame for its success or failure, ignoring the equally significant contribution of others. Biased explanations produce misunderstanding that is not only unjust but can have serious consequences. The damage caused by biased accounts is not widely acknowledged. Social injustice and misunderstanding are very serious, and scholars should do all they can to prevent them by avoiding bias as much as possible. The last main concept that we will be discussing is how to overcome personal bias. The main cause of bias is due to the individual's interest in the topic, and a historian's interest will inevitably determine the interpretation he or she provides of the past. This is why the article raises the idea of detachment, which includes the capacity to set one's interests aside while investigating accounts of the past. By being able to detach their interests from a certain topic, historians will be able to investigate the past with fairness and honesty. How do we recognise bias? As history teachers, it is essential that we understand correct strategies to assist our students in recognizing bias when they are researching historical resources. To do so, students will need to follow 4 steps. The first step of recognizing bias is outlining who created the resource. Students will need to find out the creator's age, religion, race, and occupation, and whether the creator is presenting the whole story. In order to do this, students will need to read widely to get all perspectives. It is important to recognize whether or not the creator is an expert in the topic. The next step is to outline when the resource was created. Any type of resource you look at will reflect the society and the time in which it was created. So it's useful to think about the events, people and ideas or historical context that surrounded it. Keep in mind that the less time between the event and the time of writing, the more likely certain details such as dates, names and locations will be accurate. Older documents show us what life was like in the past and can also reveal attitudes that may be uncommon or unacceptable today. Particular formats such as diaries, emails, videos, SMS, etc. reflect the era in which they were created, so think about what the format reveals about the resource. Even if the resource is only a few years old, it may not be the most up-to-date information, especially if it is part of an ongoing study or changing theories. The third step is to outline why the resource was created. Writers, artists, historians, photographers and other creators will sometimes use their work to persuade people about a particular viewpoint or interpretation of an idea or event. So it's important to work out why the resource was created. Remember, the creator's purpose is more often than not the message you remember long after you've finished reading or looking at it. In printed material, look for a range of opinions that are supported by different sources. This helps you make up your own mind about the information being presented. In secondary sources, a bibliography is often a good sign of a reputable resource, but you'll need to check whether the references listed are reliable and credible. The last step in recognizing bias is discovering who the resource was created for. Many different kinds of resources are created for many different audiences, so it's important to think about how the intended audience has affected the format and overall message in the resource. Encourage students to ask themselves, who is the target audience? Did the creator intend for their work to be looked at by someone else? Personal strategies in teaching bias in history. A couple of strategies that I believe are effective when teaching history include encouraging students to draw on their own opinions and bias and recognize their views. In doing this, students will be able to recognize the bias of other writers and authors. Helping students to find credible and reliable resources, cross-referencing that resource they have against other resources to recognize bias. It is essential when studying history that many sources are found and compared. Having previously had a significant understanding on the various forms of bias and its effect in their everyday life, I brought into this assessment plenty of prior knowledge, even to the extent of bias within the classroom. However, the degree in which bias can occur, and to the complete extent, was a surprise to me, especially in some circumstances the blatant nature to which acts of bias may occur. While I was aware of the implications of bias amongst history teachers, I was interested to discover the scale in which bias may occur and how important it is for a teacher to be aware of their own views and beliefs on the topic. For example, religion, ethnicity, etc. The simplicity in which bias may occur and the effect it may have within the classroom was another learning experience for me. The varying forms of bias and how they are categorized regarding form was also something that increased my knowledge in the topic area. One of the biggest challenges found during this assessment was the management and integration of technology. Learning to place voiceover and movies over PowerPoint was a technological challenge that I had not tackled before and proved to be one of the greatest challenges of this assessment. However, being able to utilize this skill, I believe, will be a strong asset when integrating technology within the classroom environment. The gathering of a credible source to be used as a scholarly article also proved to be a challenge. While I was able to find many sources regarding the topic, finding a scholarly article that is reliable in its resource was quite difficult. Recognizing my own forms of bias and attempting to combat them also proved to be a challenge for me. Learning about the different forms of bias and how they are ever present challenged me to recognize my own degrees of bias within my teaching and life. That brings us to the conclusion of this podcast. I hope you have gained new information and insights in recognizing and dealing with bias in history and effective teaching strategies to use within the classroom. thank you for watching.